it was beyond belief.
I'll do my best. Could do no less.
When Nolan was prepping Interstellar, he kept telling people to watch this movie from 1983 about the space program. The Right Stuff. 4 hours long, almost nobody's seen it on a big screen. Nolan calls it one of the great American movies, says it's almost perfectly made, and he couldn't buy it. The thing wasn't available on Blu-ray, so Nolan started calling Warner Home Video, hassling them to release it. Warner didn't release it, so he went and found actual film prints and screened them for his crew. What got him was the practical camera work. Nolan watched that and told his team, "If these guys could pull this off 30 years ago, we have no excuse. We're not handing everything to visual effects department. We're doing it in camera, same as they did." The Right Stuff has a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, won 4 Oscars. Nolan says most people don't realize how great it is, probably because it's 4 hours long. But when it came out, it bombed. $27 million budget made just $21 million at the box office. And that loss destroyed the studio that made it. The studio was called The Ladd Company, and the guy who ran it was Alan Ladd Jr. He was the Fox executive who greenlit Star Wars. Same guy who let George Lucas keep all the merchandise rights when Lucas had zero leverage. Fox shareholders found out about that deal and were so pissed that Ladd lost his job. So Ladd went off and started his own company. He made Blade Runner, distributed Chariots of Fire, things were going well. Then The Right Stuff flopped, another film flopped, and the Ladd Company gone bankrupt. Nolan watched Pink Floyd The Wall and his reaction was, quote, "What the f*** is that movie? It's quite marvelous." That what the f*** reaction, that was everyone in 1982. Pink Floyd had already sold about 12 million copies of the album, so getting financing wasn't the problem. The problem was nobody in Hollywood could figure out what this thing actually was. Executives kept asking director Alan Parker if it was a concert film. Parker would tell them, "No, it's not a concert film." They'd nod, think about it for a second, and ask again. "But it's a concert film though, right?" Parker spent months having this same conversation over and over. MGM finally made the deal, and the executive who greenlit it was David Begelman. He sat down with Parker and admitted that nobody at his company understood the film either. And then he said, "That's exactly why I want to make it." They premiered it at Cannes as a midnight screening. Parker was in the theater watching the audience react. At some point, he looked over and saw Steven Spielberg asking Terry Semel, who was running Warner Brothers, "What the f*** was that?" The movie did fine. $22 million on a $12 million budget, hit number 3 at the US box office behind E.T. and An Officer and a Gentleman. But it didn't have legs. People saw it, said what the f***, and moved on. Over time, it became some kind of a cult thing, and Nolan keeps saying it's a truly remarkable, impressionistic film. This film was buried for 25 years. Nicholas Roeg made Bad Timing in 1980. It's about a psychiatrist and a married woman who start an affair, but the way Roeg edited it was unlike anything people had seen before. The story keeps jumping between a suicide attempt, a police investigation, and an affair, and none of it plays in sequence. Nobody was making movies like this in 1980. That editing style became the template for how Nolan structures his films. Memento, The Prestige, all of it goes back to what Roeg did here. Directors like Edgar Wright and Danny Boyle and Steven Soderbergh all point to Bad Timing as a direct influence. But if you've never heard of it, there's a pretty good reason for that. The UK distributor was a company called Rank Organisation, and when they saw the finished film, they basically freaked out. Called it a sick film made by sick people for sick people. Then they did something you almost never see. They removed their own logo from the prints. The company that was supposed to be releasing the movie actually took their name off it. They barely put it in theaters at all. In the US, the MPAA gave it an X rating, which was basically a death sentence for theatrical distribution. Roeg tried to appeal, and film critics actually testified on his behalf, but the appeal failed anyway. So they released it unrated, which meant most theaters wouldn't show it, and then it just vanished. When Nolan was putting together the films that fed into Dunkirk, one of them was Chariots of Fire. He said there's an interesting relationship between them. It's a British film, but it clearly works for an international audience, which is exactly what he was going for with Dunkirk. But here's what people forget about Chariots of Fire. Nobody wanted to make it. The script was just sitting there collecting dust at Goldcrest Films. So Fox looked at this movie about British runners from the 1920s and said, "We'll put up half the money, but don't ask us to release it in America. Americans aren't going to watch this. Find somebody else." So Warner Brothers took the US release instead. The film made over $50 million, and $32 million of that came from America. It won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture, beating Raiders of the Lost Ark. A $6 million movie about British runners from the 1920s beat Indiana Jones. Nolan called it a masterpiece of British understatement. He talked about the visual splendor, the intertwined narratives, and especially the music. He called it aggressively anachronistic. He said the film was actually pretty radical, but its popularity kind of obscured that. And when he made Dunkirk, he was going for the same thing, something distinctly British that still worked everywhere. Summer of 1982 was absolutely packed. There's never been another one like it. Blade Runner opened on June 25th, and it walked straight into a bloodbath. E.T. had come out 2 weeks before and was making all the money. Star Trek II had opened 3 weeks before that. John Carpenter's The Thing came out the same day. Conan and Poltergeist were still in theaters. Every one of those films was easier to watch than what Ridley Scott was trying to do. Blade Runner made $42 million on a $30 million budget. That was considered a bomb. But whatever it lost at the box office, it made up for by basically reinventing how science fiction looks on screen. 40 years later, it's the reason Batman looks the way he does. Nolan said he got obsessed with it. The beauty of the density and layering of the imagery. When he was prepping Batman Begins, he kept thinking about how Scott made everything in Blade Runner feel completely real. Scott did all of that with practical sets. He didn't use CGI or some digital shortcuts. When Nolan started working on Batman Begins, he screened Blade Runner for the cast and crew and told them, "This is how we're going to make Batman." On Batman Begins, they had to build the streets of Gotham themselves, and Nolan immediately went back to what Scott had done. How you shoot these massive sets so they feel real instead of looking like impressive sets. Nolan said they were definitely trying to emulate that. There's this guy named Saul Zaentz who owned the record label that signed Creedence Clearwater Revival back in the 60s. Creedence got huge and made Zaentz rich, and after every major studio passed on a 3-hour movie about Mozart, Zaentz just wrote the check himself. $18 million of his own money for a film Hollywood said nobody would watch. Zaentz went with Orion Pictures for distribution because Orion didn't mess with filmmakers. The director Milos Forman got total control. They didn't give him any notes or restrictions on how long the movie could be. And that movie nobody wanted to make earned over $90 million worldwide and won 8 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. 40 years later, Nolan said Amadeus was a big inspiration for Oppenheimer. He loved the structure. The whole film built around the rivalry between Mozart and Salieri. He saw the same thing with Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss. 2 guys who couldn't stand each other, and you build the whole movie around that tension. Nolan said he didn't have to make much up, though. All the petty grudges between Oppenheimer and Strauss were already on the record. When Nolan cast David Bowie in The Prestige, he already knew exactly what Bowie could do on screen. He'd seen it in a 1983 film called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Nolan said it was tailor-made for Bowie's talents, one of the few films that actually captured his charisma. The movie came out the same year as Return of the Jedi, a Japanese director making his first English film set in a World War II prison camp with David Bowie as the lead and some pretty obvious homoerotic themes. Nobody was going to see this instead of Ewoks. And nobody did. Bowie plays a British soldier who gets captured and held in a Japanese prison camp. The captain running the place gets obsessed with him because Bowie's character won't play by the rules. When the movie came out, people made a big deal about Bowie being in it, but the film isn't really about him. It's about the differences between East and West, about what war does to people. Nolan saw something in Bowie's performance that stayed with him for over 20 years, and when he needed someone to play Nikola Tesla, he knew exactly who to call. Nolan saw Withnail and I at his university's all-night film show, and he said it stuck with him forever. He and his wife Emma both love it, but when the movie actually came out in 1987, almost nobody saw it. It made a little money and basically disappeared. Then students in the 90s started finding it on VHS. They'd watch it, quote it, pass it around. The thing spread through universities like a virus until it went from total obscurity to a genuine classic. The movie's about two unemployed actors in London who do nothing but sit in their filthy flat, go to the unemployment office, and drink. They decide to take a trip to the countryside and discover it's just as miserable as the city, with rain and creepy locals and nothing to do. Brits call it a masterpiece now. Edgar Wright loves it, Johnny Depp loves it, even Chris Evans paid £5,000 at auction just to own Withnail's coat from the film. Roger Ebert gave The Hitcher 0 stars. Gene Siskel also gave it 0 stars and called it a nauseating thriller, a thinly veiled but more gruesome ripoff of Spielberg's Duel. The movie flopped and vanished, and everyone assumed that was the end of it. Then Nolan comes along and says he loves it, calls Rutger Hauer's performance the best Euro-psycho acting this side of Blade Runner, but he also says the plot is mind-bendingly arbitrary. He's not pretending the movie makes sense, it's just that Hauer is so good it doesn't even need to. The film is about a guy driving a car across the country who picks up a hitchhiker played by Hauer. The hitchhiker turns out to be a serial killer. What follows is a bunch of car chases and murders that don't connect logically. But Hauer goes so hard you stop noticing. He did most of his own stunt driving and impressed the professional crew. Stephen King loves this movie too. Said what makes it work, besides the stunts, is Hauer's performance. Hollywood remade it in 2007 with Michael Bay producing. The remake made 4 times what the original grossed. It's also got a 19% on Rotten Tomatoes. Made more money, nobody remembers it. The original flopped and people still talk about it. In 1979, a guy named Al Reinert was writing a story about the Apollo program for Texas Monthly. While he was doing research, he found out that NASA had all this footage from the actual moon missions just sitting in storage. Footage the astronauts filmed themselves, high-quality stuff, and nobody had ever seen it. NASA basically forgot it was there. Reinert decided to make a documentary out of it. He thought it would take a couple of years. It took him 10. He and his editor went through 6 million feet of film, 80 hours of interviews, and what they ended up making didn't have any narrator. It's just the footage, cut together from different Apollo missions to feel like one trip with the astronauts' voices over it. That thing Reinert did, taking real footage and cutting it together out of order to build an emotional arc, that's exactly what Nolan did with Dunkirk. 3 different timelines, different lengths, all coming together at key moments. And For All Mankind was also on his mind when he made Interstellar, especially the parts about what it feels like to leave Earth. The documentary has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. Nolan called it an incredible document of man's greatest achievement.